Dad's silent revenge.
I never thought calling an AC repair guy during a 115-degree heat wave would uncover the truth about my missing son and dead wife. But when the technician looked at me with wide eyes and said, "Sir, there's a locked door up here, and my gas detector is going crazy," my whole world started falling apart. My name is Gerald Newman. I'm 58 years old, and for the past 3 years, I thought I understood my life. I was wrong about everything. This nightmare started on July 15th at 6:30 a.m. when I woke up in a house that felt like an oven. The AC was dead silent, and outside, it was already pushing 100 degrees. I live with my daughter Kathy and her husband Mark in their Scottsdale ranch house. Moved in after my wife Dorothy died 4 years ago from what the doctors called heart failure. Let me back up a bit. I spent 35 years building Newman Construction from nothing into a solid business. Started when I was 23 with a pickup truck and a toolbox, ended up with 12 crews and contracts all over the Phoenix Valley. Sold the whole operation for $1 million when Dorothy got sick. Combined with our house equity of $800 kale and our savings of $900 kalo, we built ourselves a nice nest egg of $2.8 million. Enough for a comfortable retirement, enough to help our kids, enough to make us targets. Dorothy and I had been married 38 years when she started getting headaches in the spring of 2019. At first, just little complaints here and there. "Must be the stress of your retirement, honey," she'd say, rubbing her temples while we watched the evening news. Then came the fatigue that knocked her flat after simple errands like grocery shopping. I urged her to see doctors. She went through every test you can imagine, blood work, brain scans, even saw a neurologist. Everything came back normal. They chalked it up to aging, maybe early hypertension, prescribed rest, and a low-sodium diet. Looking back now, knowing what I know, those doctors never tested for the one thing that was actually killing her. Around that same time, our air conditioning started acting up. This was our home on Camelback Road, the house we'd lived in for 20 years. When you live in Arizona, AC problems aren't just inconveniences, they're emergencies. I called a few repair companies, but Mark insisted on handling it himself. "I'm an HVAC engineer, Jerry," he reminded me with that confident grin of his. "Save yourself a few $100, I'll have it running like new." Mark had married our daughter Kathy the year before, in 2018. Seemed like a decent guy, stable job. Treated Kathy well, was great with their daughter Rachel. He'd grown up in Phoenix, went to ASU for mechanical engineering, specialized in heating and cooling systems. Made good money, around $75 kale a year, which was solid for a young guy just starting out. What I didn't know then was that Mark had problems, big problems. While I was trusting him to fix our AC, he was burning through money on online poker and sports betting. Not just pocket change either. We're talking about $150 a night, sometimes more. By the time he married Kathy, he was already into some dangerous people for serious money, but I'm getting ahead of myself. In November 2019, I woke up to find Dorothy lying still beside me. She'd passed away in her sleep. The medical examiner ruled it heart failure. I was devastated but didn't question it. Dorothy had been tired for so long, complaining about feeling weak. I thought her heart had simply given out. The funeral was beautiful. Mark and Kathy organized everything, handled all the details while I sat in a fog of grief. Our son Nate was harder to reach for the service. He'd moved to Seattle years earlier, working construction on big commercial projects. Dangerous work, but it paid well. He was pulling down 95 calico a year as a foreman on high-rise builds. He made it home for Dorothy's memorial, stayed a week helping me go through her things, then flew back to Seattle. That was the last time I saw him in person, though we talked on the phone every few weeks. By early 2020, I was rattling around alone in that big house. Every room reminded me of Dorothy. The silence was unbearable. In May, Kathy suggested I move in with them. "You shouldn't be alone right now, Dad," she said, her voice gentle but insistent. "We've got plenty of space. Mark just finished renovating the guest room downstairs. Rachel would love having her grandpa around." I hesitated at first. The last thing I wanted was to be a burden, but the truth was I was desperately lonely. The house felt like a tomb without Dorothy's laughter echoing through the rooms, so I agreed. Their place on Larkspur Drive was nice, a sprawling ranch-style house with desert landscaping and a red tile roof that reminded me of old Spanish missions. Mark had done good work on the renovation. The guest room had its own bathroom, a small sitting area, even a mini fridge. Rachel, who was 6 at the time, was a bright, giggly kid who loved showing me her drawings and asking me to read bedtime stories. For the first time since Dorothy's passing, I felt a flicker of peace. Mark treated me with respect, always asking if I needed anything, making sure I was comfortable. Kathy doted on me, cooking my favorite meals, checking in constantly. It felt like family was supposed to feel. Then in July 2020, Exactly 2 months after I'd moved in, Kathy called me into the living room with a face pale as desert sand. Her hands were trembling, tears already streaming down her face. "Dad," she said, her voice breaking. "I just got a call from Nate's supervisor in Seattle. There was an accident on the construction site. A crane collapsed during a pour on the 23rd floor. I felt the floor drop out from under me. They couldn't find him, Dad. The concrete, the debris, 7 workers were lost. They've called off the search." Mark appeared with his laptop, pulling up news articles on the screen. Headlines about the disaster, official statements, even a GoFundMe page for victims' families. I stared at the screen, numb. My son was gone. The last connection to the family Dorothy and I had built together. We held a memorial service without a casket, buried an empty box beside Dorothy's grave under that same scorching Arizona sun. I remember standing there, staring at the 2 headstones side by side, thinking I'd lost everyone I loved most. At 56 years old, I felt ancient and hollow. The years that followed blurred together like a heat mirage on asphalt. I fell into a quiet routine, helping Rachel get ready for school in the mornings, spending afternoons reading or watching old Western movies, having dinner with Mark and Kathy each evening. They were patient with my grief, understanding when I'd suddenly go quiet or excuse myself to sit alone in the backyard. Mark continued to be attentive, always asking if I needed anything. He'd bring me coffee in the mornings, help me with doctor's appointments, even taught me how to use Netflix on the big screen TV. Kathy's love felt unwavering, but sometimes late at night I'd hear strange sounds from above my room, scratching noises, like something moving around in the walls. Occasional footsteps that seemed too heavy to be Rachel playing upstairs. Once a low thud that made me sit up in bed, listening. I mentioned it to Kathy the next morning over breakfast. "Oh, that's just the attic," she said, laughing as she poured orange juice for Rachel. "We've got mice up there. Mark's been meaning to set traps." Another time, I heard what sounded like water running through old pipes at 2 in the morning. Mark assured me it was just the plumbing settling. "This house is almost 15 years old, Jerry," he said with that confident smile. "Things creak and groan. Nothing to worry about." I believed him. Why wouldn't I? Mark was an HVAC engineer. If anyone would know about house sounds, it was him. And I never went up to the attic myself. The pull-down ladder was steep, almost vertical, and Mark had warned me it wasn't safe. "Last thing we need is you taking a fall, Dad," he'd say whenever I mentioned checking things out myself. "That ladder's a death trap for someone our age." So I stayed downstairs, content in my corner of their home, never questioning the sounds above my head, never suspecting that the man who called me Dad, who brought me morning coffee and helped with my medications, had already taken everything from me and was planning to take even more. The heat wave started in early July 2023. By July 14th, Phoenix was baking under 113-degree temperatures, and the forecast called for 115 the next day. I went to bed that night with the AC humming reassuringly, the house cool and comfortable, but I woke up at 6:30 a.m. to a silence that felt wrong. The air was already thick and oppressive, sweat soaking through my t-shirt. I checked the thermostat in the hallway, 89 degrees inside and climbing. The system was completely dead. I tried calling Mark first. His phone went straight to voicemail after 2 rings. I tried again, same result. Then I remembered he'd left for Houston the day before for some big commercial project. His phone must have died overnight, or maybe he was already in meetings. Kathy was gone too, visiting her mother in Tucson with Rachel. They weren't due back until late afternoon. I was alone in a house that was rapidly turning into an oven. By 8 a.m., it hit 94 degrees inside. I opened every window, set up box fans, even filled a plastic storage container with ice water to soak my feet in. Nothing made a dent. The morning sun was already beating down mercilessly, and I could feel the house absorbing heat like a giant brick. In Arizona, you don't mess around with AC failure. People die from heat exhaustion in their own homes. I had no choice but to call for help. I found Desert Cool HVAC online, good reviews, 24-hour emergency service, reasonable rates. The dispatcher assured me someone would be there within an hour. "We understand the urgency, sir," she said. "Stay hydrated and find the coolest room in your house. Help is on the way." Vincent Parker arrived 45 minutes later in a white van with Desert Cool HVAC painted in blue letters on the side. He was younger than I expected, maybe late 20s with sandy brown hair and confident handshake. Reminded me of the young guys I used to hire for construction crews, eager, capable, ready to solve problems. "Vincent Parker," he said, shaking my hand firmly. 8 years in the HVAC business. I've seen just about every air conditioning problem you can imagine. I liked him immediately. There was something reassuring about his confidence, the way he immediately got to work checking the obvious problems first. He spent about 15 minutes outside with the condenser unit, testing electrical connections, checking refrigerant lines, examining the compressor. When he came back inside, he was wiping sweat from his forehead and shaking his head. Compressors running fine, no refrigerant leaks, electrical connections, all solid, he reported. Whatever's wrong with your system, it's not happening outside. He looked up toward the ceiling, then back at me. Your air handler, that's up in the attic, right? I nodded, feeling that first small flutter of unease. Mind if I take a look up there? I'll need to check the unit itself. Maybe the ductwork. He pulled his tool bag from the van along with a flashlight and a small handheld device that beeped softly when he turned it on. Gas detector, he explained, noticing my curious look. Standard safety equipment. Carbon monoxide, natural gas leaks, that sort of thing. Better safe than sorry, especially in older systems. I hesitated for a moment. Mark's voice echoed in my mind. All those times he told me the attic was off limits, that the ladder was dangerous, that it was just storage and HVAC equipment up there. But standing in a house that felt like it might melt around me. Mark's warnings seemed less important than the unbearable heat. Go ahead, I said. Do whatever you need to do. Vincent walked to the hallway where the attic access was located. He pulled the cord, and the folding stairs unfolded with a metallic groan that seemed louder than usual in the stifling air. He tested the first step, then started climbing his tool bag slung over one shoulder. I heard his footsteps above me, muffled but distinct against the wooden flooring of the attic. Then, after a few minutes, the sound stopped, just silence. I stood at the base of the stairs, staring up into the dark opening above. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The house was getting hotter by the minute, and I was starting to worry. What could be taking so long? I considered calling up to him, but stopped myself. Maybe the problem was more complicated than he'd expected. Maybe he was having to trace ductwork or check multiple components. I'd worked construction long enough to know that sometimes the simplest problems had the most complex solutions. 15 minutes had passed when my phone vibrated with a text message. Vincent's name appeared on the screen. I opened it, expecting an update about parts needed or repair time. Instead, the words on the screen made my blood run cold. Sir, there's a locked door up here and my gas detector is going off. You need to come see this. I stared at that message, reading it twice, then 3 times. A locked door in the attic. Mark had never mentioned any door. For 3 years, whenever I'd asked about the strange sounds, he'd told me it was just storage boxes. Old furniture, HVAC equipment, nothing about a room. Nothing about a lock and the gas detector. Why would there be gas in the attic? My hands started shaking as I typed back. What do you mean a locked door? The response came immediately. You need to see this yourself. Please come up. This isn't normal. I looked at the narrow ladder, its steep angle disappearing into darkness above. My knees already ached just thinking about the climb. But Vincent's message sounded urgent, almost alarmed. I took a deep breath, gripped the sides of the ladder, and started up. Each step felt unsteady, the metal rungs heating up from the attic air above. By the time I reached the top, sweat was pouring down my face. The attic air hit me like opening an oven door, hot, stale, and oddly metallic. The space was smaller than I'd imagined, with a sloped ceiling that forced me to duck in most places. Vincent's flashlight provided the only illumination, casting long shadows across the wooden beams and ductwork. He was standing near the far wall about 20 feet from the access opening. The gas detector in his hand was emitting a steady, high-pitched beep that made my skin crawl. Mr. Newman, he said quietly, when he heard me reach the top, I need you to tell me what this is. He stepped aside and pointed his flashlight beam toward the wall. What I saw there made my legs go weak. Behind a stack of cardboard boxes and an old metal storage shelf, the kind of stuff that belonged in any normal attic, was a door. Not a piece of plywood or a simple access panel, but an actual door with a frame, hinges, and a handle. And across the front of it, securing it shut like some kind of fortress, were 5 heavy-duty padlocks. Industrial-grade locks, the kind you'd use on a storage unit or warehouse. I felt the world tilt beneath me. I reached out and grabbed the nearest support beam to keep from falling. I don't know, I managed to say, my voice coming out as a croak. I've never been up here before. Mark always said it was dangerous, that I shouldn't. Sir Vincent interrupted, his voice calm but tense. My detector is picking up carbon monoxide, high levels. And look at this. He led me toward the air handler, the main unit that heated and cooled the house. The metal casing had been tampered with. I could see fresh scratches around the seams, and one access panel was slightly askew, like someone had been working on it recently. Vincent knelt down and pried the panel open with a screwdriver from his tool belt. Inside, I could see the familiar components, wires, coils, and the heat exchanger that warmed air during Phoenix's brief winter months. But what caught my attention were the holes. Small, deliberate holes drilled through the metal of the heat exchanger. They weren't accidental damage or normal wear. They were precise, intentional, and they definitely hadn't been there when the unit was manufactured. "This isn't a malfunction," Vincent said, standing up and facing me. "Someone sabotaged this system. These holes let carbon monoxide leak into your ductwork every time the heating system runs." He pointed toward a series of dampers near the main trunk line, metal flaps that controlled airflow to different parts of the house. "And based on what I'm seeing with these dampers, most of that poisoned air isn't going to every room in the house. It's being directed to two specific places." He paused, letting that sink in. "Your bedroom downstairs, and whatever's on the other side of that locked door." My mind was racing, trying to process what he was telling me. Someone had deliberately damaged our heating system to pump poison into specific rooms. Mark had worked on this system multiple times over the years. Mark was the only one who came up here regularly. Vincent moved closer to the mysterious door, the gas detectors beeping getting more rapid and urgent. He pressed his ear against the wood and listened intently. After a moment that felt like an eternity, he turned back to me with an expression I'll never forget. "Mr. Newman," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's someone breathing in there." I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were bolted to the attic floor. Vincent's words echoed in my head, someone breathing in there, but my mind refused to accept it. A locked room in the attic with 5 industrial padlocks, and someone inside. Vincent approached the door cautiously, the gas detector beeping frantically in his hand. He knocked once, firmly but not aggressively. "Hello? Can you hear me?" His voice was calm, professional. "If you're in there, make a sound. Tap on the door. Anything?" Silence. He knocked again, louder this time. "My name is Vincent. I'm here to help. If you can hear me, please respond." Still nothing. I stepped forward on unsteady legs and pressed my ear against the rough wood. At first, all I could hear was my own heartbeat hammering in my ears. But then, faint and irregular, I caught it. A rasping, labored breathing sound. "There," I whispered to Vincent. "Do you hear that?" He leaned in and listened. After a moment, he nodded grimly. "Yeah, someone's in there, and they're in bad shape." I pulled back and raised my voice, trying to keep it steady. "Hello? Can you hear me? If you're in there, say something. We're gonna help you." Nothing but that same struggling breath. Vincent was already reaching for his phone. "I'm calling 901. We need to get this door open, and we need paramedics standing by." "Wait," I said, my hands shaking as I pulled out my own phone. "Let me try calling Mark first. Maybe there's an explanation." I dialed his number with trembling fingers. It rang once, twice, then went to voicemail. That calm, confident voice. "You've reached Mark Thompson. Leave a message and I'll get back to you." I hung up and tried again. Same result. A third time. Nothing. Mark always answered his phone, always, unless he already knew what we'd found. "Please." I called through the door, my voice cracking with desperation. "If you can hear me, just try to say one word. Anything." For a long moment, there was nothing. Vincent had his phone halfway to his ear, ready to dial emergency services. The attic was so quiet I could hear dust motes settling on the wooden beams, then so soft I almost missed it. A voice, weak, hoarse, barely recognizable as human. "Dad," that single word hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. My knees buckled and I grabbed the doorframe to keep from collapsing completely. I knew that voice. I'd heard it 1,000 times over the years, laughing at my bad jokes, calling me from construction sites, asking for advice about life and work and women. "Dad, is that you?" My chest felt like it was caving in. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. "Nate," I choked out, pressing both palms against the door. "Nate, is that you?" There was a pause, a weak cough. Then so faintly I could barely hear it. "Yeah, it's me." The attic seemed to spin around me. My vision blurred with tears. I didn't know I was crying. Vincent was saying something beside me, but I couldn't process the words. All I could hear was my son's voice, my son who I thought had died 3 years ago in Seattle, who I'd mourned and buried in an empty grave. He was here. He'd been here the whole time, locked behind this door just 15 feet above my bedroom, where I'd slept every night for 3 years. 911. "What's your emergency?" Vincent had made the call while I was frozen in shock. "My name is Vincent Parker. I'm at 472 East Larkspur Drive in Scottsdale. We've discovered a person imprisoned in an attic room. He's been there for approximately 3 years. We need police, paramedics, and fire department immediately. There's also a carbon monoxide leak." I could barely hear the dispatcher's response over the roar of blood in my ears. The next few minutes passed in a blur. Vincent documenting everything with his phone camera, taking pictures of the sabotaged HVAC system, the locked door, the gas detector readings. The sirens came fast. Phoenix Emergency Services don't mess around with calls like this. Within 10 minutes, our quiet residential street was filled with fire trucks, ambulances, and police cars. Officer Sandra Martinez climbed into the attic with heavy-duty bolt cutters. It took her and her partner nearly 30 minutes to work through all 5 padlocks. Each lock that snapped sent a metallic crack through the air like a gunshot. When the door finally swung open, the smell hit us first. Stale air, human waste, desperation. The room beyond was tiny, maybe 8 by 10 feet with no windows. In the beam of our flashlights, I saw him. Nate was lying on a narrow cot, barely recognizable. He'd lost at least 60 pounds, his skin gray and papery, his hair grown long and matted. His clothes hung off his skeletal frame like they belonged to someone else, but his eyes were open, and they were looking at me. The paramedics moved fast, fitting an oxygen mask over his face, checking vitals, starting an IV. His pulse was weak and his oxygen levels were dangerously low. They had him on a stretcher and down from the attic within minutes. I rode with him to St. Joseph's Hospital, holding his hand while the paramedics worked. At one point, his eyes focused on me and his lips moved behind the oxygen mask. I couldn't hear what he was trying to say, but I squeezed his hand gently. "You're safe now," I whispered. "I'm here. You're gonna be okay." At the hospital, Dr. Margaret Thompson explained that Nate's blood showed carbon monoxide levels that should have killed him months ago. "Your son is extraordinarily lucky to be alive," she said. "A few more weeks of exposure at those levels, and we'd be having a very different conversation." When Nate was finally stable enough to talk, he told me everything. How he'd come to Arizona in July 2020 because his wife Sarah was having pregnancy complications, and they needed $10,000 for emergency medical care. How Mark had answered the door, offered him water, then drugged him. How he'd woken up in that room with Mark explaining that he was an obstacle to the family's financial future. For 3 years, Mark had fed him once a day through a slot in the door, just enough to keep him alive. A bowl of beans, a bottle of water, nothing more. There was a bucket in the corner for waste, no light except what leaked through a crack in the roof boards. Detective Sandra Martinez arrested Mark 3 days later at Houston Intercontinental Airport. He was trying to board a flight to Mexico with a fake passport and $50,000 in cash. They found his laptop in his Houston hotel room with a folder labeled Project N minus the logs of Nate's imprisonment, calculations of lethal carbon monoxide exposure levels, and photos of Dorothy after she died. Mark had killed my wife in 2019 as practice, perfecting his method. He'd kept Nate alive as insurance, planning to eliminate us both when his gambling debts came due. The organized crime figures he owed $180,000 had given him a deadline: get the money or face consequences. The trial was swift, the evidence was overwhelming. Mark got life without parole for Dorothy's murder and the attempted murder of Nate and me. Kathy received 8 years for conspiracy. She'd known about Nate and said nothing out of fear for Rachel's safety. 2 years later, I visit Dorothy's grave every month. Her headstone now reads, "Beloved wife and mother, justice served." Nate recovered slowly but completely. He's back in Seattle with Sarah and their daughter Lily, who's now 7 years old. We video call every Sunday. I sold Newman Construction's remaining assets and started a victim advocacy program called Hidden Doors, helping families recognize financial manipulation and domestic threats. I tell our story to police departments, social workers, anyone who will listen. The lesson I've learned is simple. Trust is precious, but awareness is survival. Sometimes the people who call you family are planning your funeral. Sometimes a broken air conditioner and a young technician with integrity can save your life. And sometimes when you think you've lost everything, you discover that hope was just locked away, waiting for someone to care enough to look. Trust without verification becomes a weapon in the wrong hands. The people closest to you have the most power to destroy you, but also the most opportunity to hide their true intentions behind the mask of family love. Sometimes the greatest act of love isn't trusting blindly, but staying alert enough to protect the people who matter most, because evil doesn't announce itself with horns and pitchforks. It moves in with a smile and calls you dad while planning your funeral.